Developing a vaccine normally takes years, so it was obvious we couldn't follow our normal procedure.
It was daunting. If we developed a vaccine that couldn't be used, it'd be a disaster.
That was one possible scenario, because we just didn't know enough. The level of urgency was extremely high.
I don't know how they did it all in the fastest time possible.
I thought, if we're in lockdown, then why not? I'm going to take part in the trial.
It's pretty exciting to find out that history is truly being written in Mainz.
In 2020, a company based in Mainz, Germany, was set to revolutionize medicine. As early as January, Uğur Şahin and Özlem Türeci had begun working on a vaccine against SARS-CoV-2. It turned out to be the world's first highly effective vaccine. Security measures around the couple at BioNTech are tight. The most valuable thing the researchers possess at the moment is their time. Nevertheless, they were prepared to give a lot of it for this film.
We first met many years ago. It was 1991, and I was in my final year of studying medicine. That's when you spend much of your day on the ward. I arrived on a ward where Ugur was interning as a doctor, and he was in charge of the station. So that means right from day one, Ugur has always made me work hard. On a cancer ward like that, you really get to know one another. You see firsthand how the other reacts in different situations, how they react to patients who are sick, who need care, when emergencies happen. It's crucial to be on top of your game and to be able to deal with new types of treatment.
It wasn't just that it was very intense work, but you often also found yourself having to tell patients you couldn't offer them any more treatment. I saw with what dedication and precision Ozlem did her job. The patients and nurses loved her, and we often spoke about all sorts of topics. We then realized that we were both working in science, and we both had innovative ideas for helping patients. Those conversations led to us meeting privately, and that ultimately brought us together.
Since then, they've been together in science and in life, and even have a daughter together. Then, a few years later, an invitation from Austrian cancer researcher Christoph led to them starting research at the Gutenberg University in Mainz.
I first got to know them personally in the mid-90s. It was obvious then that we needed them both in our area of special research, both because of who they were as people and because of their total commitment.
Absoluten commitments.
The key element in their research centered around messenger RNA. The foundations had already been laid by a scientist who herself had roots in Hungary.
I started to work at University of Pennsylvania in 1989, and then immediately I started to focus to make mRNA, focus on that project, and I just looked it up. Actually, in 1990 was first time my first grant was rejected, and which was written about mRNA to use as a therapy. And that time it was just mRNA coded for the reporter protein. And since the major worry was stability of RNA, my first proposal was to make circular RNA. First paper actually on vaccine came out in the French laboratories, Pierre Meurin Laboratory 93. They used messenger RNA and vaccinated mice against influenza. And they used liposome formulation. And later here in US, Duke University, Ellie Gilboa, they did a lot of effort to make a cancer vaccine. And Ellie Gilboa's work inspired CureVac founder Ingmar Hör, as well as Uğur Şahin.
That was the first time we worked with mRNA and saw in humans that mRNA really did exhibit high levels of activity in dendritic cells. And that's when we knew that we had the basic technology that could enable us to get the tumor antigens we were studying into dendritic cells as part of a therapeutic cancer vaccine.
Messenger RNA contains genetic information necessary for making proteins. In a vaccine, the mRNA molecule contains instructions to produce a tiny piece of the virus. In SARS-CoV-2, that's the spike protein, which itself is harmless. When you're vaccinated, the mRNA molecule transports the instructions for making this spike protein into the body. The spike protein is then produced inside the ribosomes of the body's cells, with one single purpose in mind: for the immune system to recognize the alien protein and then to produce an immune response.
There are multiple modules. It's not just an individual element, they are all modules. And we examined every single one of these modules and optimized the process and found out that our mRNA produces more than 1,000 times more protein than in normal, natural circumstances.
Türeci and Şahin were carrying out research into mRNA modules long before the arrival of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. They'd been researching the technology to find a vaccine against cancer. In 2008, the couple founded the BioNTech company, becoming one of just a few medical research teams to go into business while keeping close ties to the academic field.
Dann hat Ugur irgendwann mal sozusagen sein Buch
At some point, Ugur opened his heart and told us about his vision for the next big advance in cancer treatment.
in der Krebstherapie aussieht.
That was really when the idea for BioNTech was born.
Von BioNTech.
Und nachdem wir schon 3, 4
And by the time we'd invested 3 or 4 times in BioNTech, we were so fascinated by these two personalities, I left the meeting and went straight to my brother's office and said, "Dearest brother, you have to come see this. They're the real deal."
Die musst du dir anschauen, die sind es.
Und ich wusste von den Resultaten.
And I remember what kind of results they were producing with Ozlem as CEO.
Kühlschrank.
I thought, if they're already working on such important antibodies, just think what potential they have.
Ich habe dann Professor Hengartner in Zurich.
So I looked up Professor Hengartner in Zurich, and he told me that they were the most impressive postdocs he ever had. That's all we needed to know. We said, right, we're investing in those two, in their team.
In das Team.
We noticed that the Strüngmanns had a totally different approach than the average venture capital investors.
Und dieses Unerbittliche auf den Inhalt zu schauen.
And this unrelenting scrutiny of what we were doing is what led us to build a company able to truly offer solutions, because we'd notched up so many innovations.
Dadurch, dass wir so viele Innovationen angesammelt haben.
That would have been impossible in any other country or with another group of investors.
Gar nicht möglich gewesen, weil heutzutage
Today, investments are always made with an eye to optimization.
Optimierung ist.
Scientific optimization simply takes time, patience, and honest communication, and the willingness to put in investment for a decade or longer.
January 24th, 2020 became an historic date not only for BioNTech, but for the whole world. When Uğur Şahin read about a coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan in a business magazine, he knew right away that the virus wouldn't stay within China's borders for long.
He was alarmed by that. And I've lived with Ugur long enough to know he doesn't worry easily.
I made a few really conservative projections. I took an infection rate of 2 to 3. I assumed that anyone was vulnerable to catching it. And the longer I looked at it, the clearer it became that in all probability we were looking at an outbreak that had already spread round the world.
The virus was dangerous because it was new. No one had antibodies against the viral infection, and anyone could get infected. There was no protection. It didn't only trigger a simple lung disease, but also what's called a multi-system disorder. It was able to attack various organs, infect and damage them.
By then, our mRNA technology had been tried and tested in hundreds of clinical studies in cancer patients. Ugur realized we could use it to produce an immune response pattern that under certain conditions could protect against sickness and maybe even against infection.
But BioNTech wasn't the only company working with mRNA technology. German firm CureVac and US company Moderna were also using the method to find a vaccine. But how does it work? When the SARS-CoV-2 virus infects a vaccinated person, the immune system recognizes the spike protein and triggers an immune response. B lymphocytes, or B cells for short, produce antibodies that attach themselves to the spike proteins. That prevents the virus from penetrating cells, while at the same time marking the virus. Thanks to their immune memory, battalions of T cells are able to seek out the cells that have been infected with the virus. And then white blood cells known as phagocytes ingest and destroy all of those tagged or infected cells, thereby stopping further infection.
That weekend I designed vaccine sequences. I took our mRNA vectors and put it all together. Then I sent all our employees an email telling them we would meet on Monday. As soon as I began explaining to my colleagues how we were going to have to work, I got the first objections. People were saying that it would be impossible. I said, yes, you're right, but we have to completely change our way of thinking. If you tell me something's impossible because it's outside the law of physics, I'll accept it. The limit of physics is light speed. And in that breath I said, we're calling this project Light Speed, so that everyone realizes that we, like light, must take the shortest and quickest route possible to develop this vaccine.
I think it really started to sink in when Ugur told the board that he wanted to start Project Lightspeed. It was obvious. If this is Ugur's idea, this is serious.
According to the World Health Organization, more than 300 manufacturers began working on a vaccine against the coronavirus in 2020. Most used well-known vaccine procedures. But it was two new ideas that proved to be the most successful: mRNA-based vaccines and viral vector vaccines. The Pasteur Institute in Paris is one of the leading centers for basic research in medicine and biology. Its director, Christoph is familiar with the difficulties surrounding mRNA technology but also its advantages.
Je pense qu'elle reste encore onéreuse et donc avec une
It's expensive and difficult to store and distribute, so it's not necessarily suited to developing countries. The benefit of an RNA vaccine is that it works quicker and is perhaps more versatile than a viral vector vaccine. Nevertheless, we still use viral vectors like the one for measles at the Pasteur Institute. The production costs are much lower.
Le coût de production est bien moindre.
The RNA vaccine is an addition to our existing arsenal, but we shouldn't believe that all of the other platforms will become obsolete simply because we have an RNA vaccine.
Les autres plateformes vont disparaître parce que la vaccination ARN a réussi.
But at this point in time, there was no vaccine. The virus had arrived in Europe, and the whole continent went into lockdown. People began to die of COVID-19, and soon the numbers were higher than in China, where the virus originated. In January of 2020, few people had taken Uğur Şahin's grim prediction seriously. But by now, BioNTech was already a decisive step ahead.
I had selected 8 candidates for preclinical trials, and my team selected another 12 to 15 candidates. So we had more than 20 candidates who could be tested in preclinical trials. The aim was to identify 4 candidates who would then undergo clinical trials.
What we basically did in that first week was decide to get everything ready for clinical trials.
We had the capacity to carry out clinical trials and recruit hundreds and hundreds of people.
BioNTech science is excellent. But what it can't do, of course, is carry out a clinical trial of 40,000 people, or carry out the distribution afterwards.
So on Monday, I called up my colleague at Pfizer and said, "We want to develop a vaccine. Are you interested in going into partnership on this?" And the reply was, "No, it's too early. There are virus outbreaks every year, and this one will be stopped before a vaccine even gets to the clinical trial phase."
In the meantime, the pandemic had reached New York. People were dying, and soon the number of deaths had reached the thousands. 6 weeks later, Pfizer and BioNTech sealed a deal on cooperation. The pandemic forced everyone involved to rethink structures and speed up work processes. Developing a vaccine is usually a hugely expensive process that takes years, something that only the big pharmaceutical companies have time and money for. Preclinical development is the first stage on the way to making a new vaccine. Sometimes it takes many years to complete. At the end of that stage, the clinical trials can begin. This is where the vaccine is trialed on human test subjects. This complex process is done in several stages, usually completed one after another. If this phase is successful, the vaccine is submitted for approval by the European Medicines Agency, the EMA. If all the data meet the requirements, the vaccine gets approval. This means the green light for production of the new vaccine. Before they're supplied for use, the individual components of the vaccine are also examined by Germany's drug regulatory body, the Paul-Ehrlich Institute, and in France, the ANSM. At the same time, pharmacovigilance, or drug safety, ensures side effects are constantly documented, checked, and assessed.
Aber es gab dann immer wieder Herausforderungen. Das heißt, es ist beileibe nicht so gewesen, dass alles dann.
But challenges kept cropping up. It wasn't a case of beginner's luck. When things wouldn't work, we'd have a meeting at 11 o'clock at night and then sit there until 1:30 in the morning trying to find out what the lab values were and how to find a technical solution. Then at 2 in the morning, the other team would take over and the work would continue.
Die ganze Entwicklung des Impfstoffs.
The vaccine's development wasn't geared up to manufacturing a new vaccine against the coronavirus.
Sondern die ganze Arbeit von BioNTech.
All of BioNTech's work was planned around producing a vaccine against cancer cells.
Krebszellen hergestellt wird.
Das war eine recht atemlose Zeit davor. Wir haben wirklich
You could hardly catch your breath during that time. We basically worked around the clock, and the impossible was made possible. A few weeks earlier, there had been nothing, and now we had a vaccine that fulfilled all the criteria. Someone was getting vaccinated. It was really exciting for us to watch that first vaccination. Of course, it's all carried out under safe conditions, with doctors on standby who stay and monitor what's going on.
Miriam Sachs is a theater director in Berlin. When the pandemic broke out, she made an unusual decision to become a test subject in trials for a vaccine with totally unknown consequences.
I thought if we're in lockdown, then why not? I'm going to take part in the trial. You're sealed off in a hospital ward and your body is exposed to something and you don't know what will happen. You start by going to an info evening where you're told all about it. You haven't signed anything at that point. You're meant to sleep on it. I had my first vaccination on May 13th at 10:05. I was the 13th test subject. The first test subjects reacted really badly. We had to keep diaries. My first night was terrible. 4 o'clock, aching limbs. I kept going hot and cold. A nurse comes and takes my blood pressure and brings some blankets. Temperature 38.5. I should add that I got an early variation of the vaccine. It wasn't the one everyone gets now. The main trial, phase 3, was completed, but my trial wasn't finished by the time the vaccine was announced and went on the market. It still isn't. That annoyed me a bit. You feel a bit ignored or like a leaf left dangling on a tree.
Several versions of the vaccine were trialed in parallel. In the final phase of clinical tests, the company chose the vaccine candidate that had the least amount of side effects. It wasn't the one that Miriam Sachs had been given.
And
then this letter arrived and it said, the trial is not yet complete. Now it's up to you to decide whether or not you get vaccinated. But how would I know what my reaction to it would be? No one told me what my situation was. Was I officially vaccinated or unvaccinated? Let's take 5-10 minutes break.
As a test subject, Miriam Sachs had to live with a high level of uncertainty. It wasn't until summer of 2021, when she got a regular vaccine, that she felt completely protected against the virus.
I muss allerdings sagen, anders als in vielen anderen Situationen.
I have to say this was different to many other situations. In the past, I was stressed and anxious about the first test subjects or patients when they were treated for the very first time with something that we developed. This time, I was more reassured because we were very familiar with mRNA.
Then, on the 24th of July, we selected vaccine candidate BNT162b2 for the phase 3 trial. A total of 44,000 test subjects were vaccinated. Half of them were administered our vaccine and the other half a placebo, a non-active substance. We hoped that by November we'd be able to say for the first time that the group with the vaccine had fewer infections than the group with the control substance.
November 9th, 2020 was a major day for the crucial third phase. An independent committee was set to publish its findings.
Of course, we were very, very excited. That Sunday was our day of truth. If the data showed the study had proved negative, then basically our entire investment in the past 10 months would have been in vain. But the data was perfect. We had 95% vaccine efficacy.
That day was really like the moon landing, getting out of the capsule and saying, it works.
It was amazing. It was a major coup for BioNTech, for German biotechnology as a whole, I should say.
It was news that was relevant for the entire world. Obviously, we had to make it public immediately.
Overnight, BioNTech held the key to ending the pandemic in its hand. People and governments all over the world had been waiting for this moment. A new chapter was beginning for Project Lightspeed.
We did something we hadn't done before, which was to negotiate with governments around the world.
Right from the start, we were aware of the potential for dependence on governments wanting to get their hands on the vaccine for export. We took a very pragmatic approach.
And so what governments did was they hedged their bets. That means that they bought vaccine from new technologies and they bought vaccines that were based on old technologies, because no one knew which vaccine in the end would work. And a lot of the time we spent discussing science, actually. We signed in November a supply agreement with the European Union. And I think what the European Commission saw was that we really were quite reliable in our delivery. And that actually led to the Commission, representing 27 states, signing an agreement with us for up to 1.8 billion doses over the next 2 years, starting at the end of this year, which is the largest pharmaceutical contract ever in the history of the pharmaceutical industry.
I came here in 2019 as head of antibodies production while doing work for Novartis. Then in 2020 it was announced that we were to become part of the BioNTech world. That was really exciting, of course. And of course, it's a personal change, switching firms. You get new colleagues, you have to establish what kind of mindset everyone's working in. Is it the same?
Very early on we met for an evening and could see that people got on. Culturally, we got on. There were two teams that could work together, and at the very least, things would function and would be enjoyable.
The next question we asked was naturally a technical one. How does this process work? None of us had ever produced mRNA before. I understand people asking why it takes so long, but for the number of processes that need to be learned and carried out, 6 months is nothing.
mRNA is produced in a biochemical process, similar to natural processes in human cells. Usually, mRNA is broken down immediately after entering the body, before it can have an effect. To prevent that, a technique was developed. The mRNA is packed into tiny bubbles of fat called lipid nanoparticles. Shielded inside the lipids, the mRNA can reach the cell before then being unloaded.
It's like going to the World Cup with a team of amateurs and winning. There'll always be slip-ups.
The team had been working for 2 weeks in a 3-shift system. Then at night, between Saturday and Sunday, around 3:30, the filter burst. 2 weeks of work literally went down the drain. It was gone, and they had to start from scratch. But that also meant the study was delayed. Production was delayed. Early on Sunday, I called Ugur and told him we had a problem. I said, overnight we lost our starting material. We have to start from scratch. And Ugur's reaction was, the poor team.
2020 was drawing to an end, but the journey had just started for the vaccine. It was transported to neighboring European countries, but also South America and Asia. Its arrival often accompanied by fanfare. Could these cargo planes be carrying the thing that might eventually put an end to the pandemic?
En un an de temps, alors que si on regarde le pipeline.
If you looked at what was in the pipeline for Moderna or BioNTech a year previously, you wouldn't have seen a single RNA molecule fit for the market.
Arrivé en commercial, c'est en un an d'avoir réussi.
In just 1 year, they succeeded in developing a product and marketing it on a large scale.
Une échelle qui est considérable.
We initially planned to go full capacity and deliver 1.6 billion doses in 2021. Then we noticed other vaccine manufacturers had delays or had dropped out altogether.
For us, it was really the end of one batch is just the beginning of the next one.
At production sites in Idar-Oberstein, Marburg, and other locations abroad, BioNTech employees were working feverishly to expand production. Meanwhile, the world was waiting for the vaccine. A few weeks after BioNTech, in January 2021, the Moderna and AstraZeneca vaccines were given approval, first in the EU and then in Switzerland. In Europe, plenty of huge vaccination centers had been built across the continent, but the vaccine was still hard to come by. It was first administered to those at high risk.
It was incredible. In the middle of the second wave after Christmas, after the BioNTech vaccine was approved, the impact was very noticeable in the first care homes we started vaccinating. During the first wave, it was terrible. You'd go back and realize how many patients from the first visit were now dead. When the vaccination started and the second dose was complete, we saw a complete turnaround. We came to carry out tests in the care homes and saw the infection rates had plummeted.
But despite the scientific successes, many people remained anxious and had concerns about the vaccine. They wondered if the new vaccine had been adequately tested before its approval. And could it really be that effective?
Ich bin oft gefragt worden, im Bekanntenkreis, aber auch
I've often been asked by friends and in interviews with the media, has it really had proper approval? It's been rushed through so quickly. There must be risks attached. But no, the actual approval procedures were all followed. Clinical studies were set up so we could tell whether this vaccine would work well and whether there would be certain risks.
We firmly believe in the personal right to choose, not least because we're doctors and we've always had situations with our patients where we cannot make that decision for someone, especially when an invasive treatment is concerned, when you're injecting something into someone's body.
No shortcuts were made with this vaccine. It went through a rigorous program. And that's why anyone who wants to find out for themselves can look at the data.
But a virus that can get around like SARS-CoV-2, infecting millions of people, inevitably ends up mutating. The Delta variant in particular made the fight against COVID-19 much harder.
We knew our vaccine would work because at that point we'd already carried out experiments. But we also knew we'd have to continue following these mutations and that the virus would carry on mutating over the next few months or couple of years, adapting to people and the conditions of its environment.
The virus is constantly multiplying. And in doing so, random errors occur in the virus's genetic code. Only some of them are relevant, though. They alter the properties of the virus, thereby creating a mutation. For example, it can change the virus and make it more easily transmissible, and therefore more contagious.
I talked to Ugur, and he told me that we would need about 6 weeks to make a new vaccine. Then it would be sufficient to fight against new variants. And today we know that the mRNA vaccine, both the BioNTech and the Pfizer, as well as the Moderna vaccines, they are still effective against the variants. And I am convinced that now if there is a new variant will come, that production is scaled up, is solved the problem, and so we can generate new vaccines.
There are viruses for which a vaccine gives you lifelong immunity. For example, polio or smallpox. But this is a virus where we know we have to administer a booster to stay immune.
Herd immunity always depends on the variant of the virus. At the moment, we're talking about 85%. For people to lead a normal life, I personally think that everyone should be given the chance to protect themselves from this virus with a vaccine.
The World Health Organization has called on pharmaceutical companies to waiver their patent rights on all medicines, all vaccines and drugs that are aimed at addressing the problem of COVID-19.
NGOs and a number of governments were also hoping that a patent waiver would result in wider production of the vaccine. That would especially help lower-income countries get their populations vaccinated. But the EU and most of its member states have been skeptical about waiving patents.
A patent waiver wouldn't just lead to a short-term supply of extra doses. On the contrary, it could lead to chaos. Raw materials could start running out and be wrongly distributed, and that could mean not being able to guarantee production quality.
For us, it's important that we can supply our vaccine to countries with lower income. In the next 18 months, we're sending 2 billion doses to countries with lower and middle incomes.
There's still a huge sea of infectious diseases out there that we want to continue working on. We're going to open an mRNA production plant in Singapore, so we've got a backup for Marburg. Things can happen, and you need 2 large plants that you can work between. We've said we'd like to produce the vaccine locally in Africa. That's important because during a pandemic, supplies and distribution are focused on where it's produced, which itself is more of a political challenge. But to break through everything, you have to produce locally.
BioNTech's economic success has been blinding. Almost overnight, the mid-sized company from Mainz exploded on the stock market. At times during August 2021, it was worth more than some of the biggest companies in Germany. How do its founders deal with that kind of success?
Wir waren vor 2 Jahren noch in einer Situation, wo wir
2 years ago, we were in a situation where we kept having to present our results every year, having to explain what we were going to do for those results. But now, thanks to the income we're generating, we can push forward with our vision much faster and to a greiter level.
beschleunigter.
And that means we're focusing 100% on what we're doing.
Wir konzentrieren uns momentan wieder 100% auf die Inhalte.
Ich glaube, was wir jetzt gerade erleben.
I think what we're currently seeing is just the tip of the iceberg.
Wahrscheinlich wird die RNA-Technologie.
mRNA technology will probably turn medicine upside down for autoimmune diseases, intestinal diseases, rheumatic diseases. There will probably be even more. It's at the very least my dream, and I can't even imagine in the whole cosmos of possibilities what we're going to see happening in the next 5 years.
Das hört sich ein bisschen an wie Science Fiction, aber
It sounds a bit like science fiction, but it's become reality, at least in clinical studies. It means that we're able to identify the molecular fingerprint, the cancer mutation in every single patient. It's totally different in every patient, as individual as each patient themselves.
so individuell wie jeder Patient selbst.
If BioNTech's hopes are realized, mRNA technology could help make a huge leap forward in the treatment of cancer.
With this success and the financial success, we're now in a position to significantly speed up these treatments for cancer immunotherapy. We had already started projects on a vaccine for TB and HIV. 3 weeks ago, we announced we'd like to develop a vaccine for malaria.
As a scientist, usually we don't look back that much. We are usually look forward. And I know that when I went BioNTech, I want to make sure that this modified mRNA, I want to see to enter to the clinic. And when I was there, I want to see when the first project with Sanofi was progressing, that okay, I want to see the first person to be injected. And when it was injected, I said, I want to see the first person to get better.
Yeah. Es ist noch nicht vorbei.
We're not done yet.
Without long scientific procedures and a bit of risk-taking, there can be no innovation. But research just can't be left up to the experts. For scientific innovation to have real social impact, you also need entrepreneurial spirit, just like Özlem Türeci, Uğur Şahin, and the BioNTech team have shown.